Hello, and welcome to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we gently embark upon a journey back to a time when the subtlest of punctuation marks could ignite the most fervent intellectual skirmishes. Imagine for a moment a quiet study in the mid-19th century, gaslight flickering softly over a scholar's desk, a freshly printed dictionary lying open before them. Their gaze falls not upon a complex definition, nor a peculiar etymology, but upon a tiny, seemingly innocuous dash, a hyphen. What might appear to us today as a minor typographical detail was then a battleground for linguistic purists, nationalistic sentiments, and commercial interests. Yet, for all its perceived insignificance, the placement, or indeed the very existence, of this slender line could provoke years of heated debate, shaping the very fabric of American English for generations to come. To truly comprehend the fervour sparked by this diminutive punctuation mark, we must journey back to the mid-19th century and meticulously trace the evolving landscape of American lexicography. Our narrative begins not with grand declarations or revolutionary acts, but with the slow, almost imperceptible shifts in how a nascent American identity sought to define itself through language. In the early decades of the 19th century, the United States was, in many respects, still finding its voice, both literally and figuratively. Political independence had been secured, but cultural and linguistic independence remained a more gradual and often contentious endeavour. English, of course, was the predominant language, inherited from the former colonial power. But even within this shared linguistic heritage, a distinct American idiom was beginning to emerge, influenced by new geographies, diverse populations, and the spirit of democratic innovation. This period witnessed the rise of American lexicography, an enterprise that was far more than a mere compilation of words and their definitions. It was, in essence, an attempt to codify, stabilize, and, in some cases, reform the language for a new nation. Dictionaries were not just reference tools. They were prescriptive authorities, intended to guide education, standardize printing practices, and ultimately to lend coherence and respectability to American English. Before the towering influence of figures like Noah Webster, English orthography, particularly concerning compound words and their hyphenation, was often a tangled affair, marked by inconsistencies that varied from printer to printer, region to region, and even within the works of a single author. There was a general understanding of what a hyphen did, it joined words, but the rules governing its application were fluid, often unstated, and profoundly subjective. The linguistic landscape of the early 19th century was characterized by a certain dynamic instability. Orthography, the accepted spelling of words, was still in flux for many common terms. Capitalization was often inconsistent, punctuation varied widely, and the rules for compounding words, especially with hyphens, were far from settled. This lack of universal adherence to a single standard created a fertile ground for argument, particularly among those who believed that a robust, clear, and uniquely American language was essential for the nation's intellectual and cultural maturity. It is into this environment of evolving standards and aspirational linguistic clarity that we introduce the monumental figure of Noah Webster. Webster's grand vision was nothing less than the establishment of an independent American English, distinct in its orthography and vocabulary from its British progenitor. He firmly believed that a nation's language was intrinsically linked to its sovereignty and identity. To continue relying solely on British dictionaries and orthographic conventions was, in his view, a form of intellectual subservience. His efforts were not merely academic, they were profoundly nationalistic. He sought to simplify spellings, streamline grammar, and, crucially for our narrative, provide a systematic approach to word formation, including the often perplexing realm of compound words. Webster's groundbreaking, compendious dictionary of the English language, published in 1806, was an early manifestation of this vision. It was followed, more than 2 decades later, by his magnum opus, an American Dictionary of the English Language in 1828. These works were seminal, not just for their extensive word lists and definitions, but for Webster's deliberate orthographic reforms. He famously advocated for spellings like colour instead of colour, theatre instead of theatre, and public becoming public. His stated goal was to make English more phonetic, more logical, and ultimately easier for American children to learn. When it came to compound words, Webster generally exhibited a tendency towards consolidation, often removing hyphens where he felt the meaning of the combined words had clearly merged into a single concept. For instance, he might favor fireman over fireman, or schoolmaster over schoolmaster. His philosophy was often driven by a desire for simplicity and an understanding that language naturally evolves to merge frequently paired words into single units. He observed that when two words consistently appeared together to denote a single entity or idea, the hyphen was often an intermediate stage before their eventual coalescence into a solid compound. This approach, while seemingly pragmatic, often lacked the kind of explicit, detailed rules that later generations of lexicographers would crave. Indeed, one of the more significant factors contributing to the later debates was the relative lack of explicit, systematic hyphenation rules articulated in Webster's initial prefaces. While he certainly made choices regarding hyphenation within his dictionary, he did not always lay out a comprehensive theoretical framework or a detailed set of principles for why those choices were made. This absence of a clear, codified doctrine meant that his successors and revisers were often left to interpret his spirit or tendency, rather than adhering to rigid, predefined guidelines. This interpretive leeway became a central point of contention, as different editors, with their own perspectives on linguistic evolution and orthographic correctness, would later apply varying philosophies to the vast corpus of words in the dictionary. Webster's approach also reflected a tension between usage and principle. While he was a reformer, he also acknowledged the importance of common usage in shaping language. However, when common usage was inconsistent, he felt compelled to apply principles of etymology, analogy, and logical clarity to make a definitive choice. This subjective balancing act, while inherent to lexicography, opened avenues for legitimate disagreement among scholars who might weigh usage, etymology, or logic differently. The groundwork for a prolonged debate over hyphenation, therefore, was subtly laid by the very ambitions and methodologies of America's first great lexicographer. The torch of Webster's lexicographical legacy was picked up, not directly by an heir in the academic sense, but by a commercial enterprise, the Merriam Brothers, in 1843, G&C. Merriam, a publishing firm based in Springfield, Massachusetts, acquired the rights to Webster's American Dictionary of the English Language from his heirs. This acquisition marked a pivotal moment, transforming Webster's scholarly endeavor into a commercial powerhouse. The Merriam brothers, George and Charles, were astute businessmen with a keen understanding of the market. Their vision was to make Webster's dictionary the definitive American dictionary, a standard for every schoolroom, every home, and every printing press across the nation. To achieve this ambitious goal, they understood that the dictionary could not remain static. Language is a living entity, constantly evolving, incorporating new words, shedding old ones, and subtly shifting in its orthographic conventions. The imperative, therefore, was for constant revision and update. The Merriam brothers committed to regularly updating the dictionary, ensuring its currency and its continued authority. However, this commitment brought them face to face with the inherent challenge of inheriting a massive intellectual work that, despite its brilliance, did not always provide perfectly consistent or explicitly articulated orthographic rules, particularly concerning the delicate matter of hyphenation. The task of revision often fell to individuals with close ties to Webster himself. At least initially, Chauncey A. Goodrich, Webster's son-in-law and a professor at Yale College, was entrusted with the significant task of revising the dictionary for its 1847 edition. Goodrich was a scholar of considerable repute, and his approach to the revision was largely conservative. He sought to preserve the spirit of Webster's reforms, while also addressing inconsistencies and incorporating new words and senses that had entered the language. His work, though meticulous, was also necessarily an act of interpretation. Goodrich's revisions, while maintaining much of Webster's original thrust, also introduced subtle shifts in hyphenation practices. These shifts were often not based on revolutionary new principles, but rather on Goodrich's own judgment, informed by his extensive knowledge of the language, his understanding of current usage among educated speakers, and the practical demands of creating a consistent and comprehensive reference work. He sought a balance between Webster's tendency toward consolidation and the need for practical clarity, which sometimes meant retaining hyphens where Webster might have omitted them, or vice versa, without always laying out an exhaustive theoretical basis for each decision. This ongoing, somewhat intuitive evolution of hyphenation rules, carried out by revisers in the absence of a perfectly explicit original doctrine, would become one of the fundamental sources of contention as other lexicographers and linguistic authorities entered the fray. The Merriam brothers, in their pursuit of commercial dominance, inadvertently amplified these subtle variances, as each new edition became a target for scrutiny from their burgeoning competition. That competition primarily coalesced around another towering figure in American lexicography, Joseph Emerson Worcester. Worcester's background was distinct from Webster's, and his approach to lexicography reflected a different philosophy. Born in 1784, Worcester was a contemporary of Webster, but came to prominence slightly later. He was known for his meticulous scholarship and his somewhat more conservative outlook on language reform. While Webster championed an independent American English, Worcester was often perceived as advocating for a standard that remained more closely aligned with traditional British English orthography and usage. His early works, such as A Universal Critical and Pronouncing Dictionary of the English Language, published in 1846, established his reputation as a formidable lexicographer. Worcester's magnum opus, however, was his Dictionary of the English Language, published in 1860. This dictionary was explicitly designed as a direct challenger to the dominance of Webster's work, particularly the Merriam-Webster editions. Worcester's dictionary was lauded for its comprehensiveness, its careful distinctions in meaning, and its attention to etymology. Critically, it also presented distinct hyphenation practices that often diverged from those found in the various editions of Webster's dictionary. Where Webster, and later his Merriam revisers, often leaned towards the consolidation of compound words into solid forms, Worcester frequently adopted a more cautious approach, showing a greater inclination to retain hyphens in certain compounds. He was less disposed to hasten the merger of words that, in his view, still retained a degree of separate identity, or where the hyphen served a useful purpose in distinguishing meaning or aiding pronunciation. For example, where a Webster edition might present railroad, Worcester might prefer railroad. Or, where Webster had moved toward today, Worcester might steadfastly stick with today. These differences, though seemingly minor to the modern eye, were profoundly significant at the time. The differing hyphenation practices became a prominent feature of what was famously dubbed the War of the Dictionaries. This was not merely a battle over which dictionary contained more words or offered superior definitions. It was a heated contest for intellectual authority, commercial supremacy, and crucially, for the very soul of American English orthography. Every subtle divergence, every retained or omitted hyphen, became a point of contention, picked apart by critics, defended by proponents, and debated in academic circles and popular periodicals. Worcester's dictionary often appealed to those who valued tradition, scholarly consistency, and a certain perceived elegance in language, while Webster's, particularly under Merriam's marketing, championed innovation, simplification, and a distinctly American character. The humble hyphen, therefore, found itself squarely at the center of this linguistic conflict, embodying fundamental differences in lexicographical philosophy and nationalistic sentiment. The substance of the hyphenation debate, when peeled back layer by layer, reveals a fascinating interplay of linguistic principles and practical considerations. At its very core lay a fundamental question: what, precisely, constitutes a compound word? This seemingly simple query was anything but. A compound word, generally defined as two or more words acting together as a single conceptual unit, is not a static entity. Its life cycle often progresses from separate words to hyphenated words and eventually to a single, solid word. Lexicographers in the mid-19th century were attempting to codify and standardize this dynamic, ongoing process, a task fraught with inherent difficulties. They were trying to capture a moving target, to impose order on a naturally evolving system. The hyphen's primary function was understood to be an indicator of this conceptual unity. It signaled that two or more elements, while still distinct in their individual components, were to be read and understood as a single idea. This function branched out into several specific applications. Firstly, the hyphen was vital for avoiding ambiguity in meaning or pronunciation. Consider, for instance, the difference between recover, to cover again, and recover, to get well. Without the hyphen, clarity could be lost, leading to misinterpretation. Secondly, it was used to join elements that, while forming a single concept, still retained some individual identity, such as in mother-in-law. Here, mother-in and law each hold meaning, but together hyphenated, they denote a specific familial relationship. Thirdly, hyphens were frequently employed to indicate temporary compounds, particularly adjectival phrases modifying a noun, as in a well-known author. The phrase well-known functions as a single adjective describing the author, and the hyphen clarifies this adjectival role. The arguments advanced by proponents of hyphenation were often rooted in a desire for clarity and precision. They contended that hyphens prevented misreading, guiding the eye and the mind to correctly interpret complex terms. From an etymological perspective, hyphens were seen as accurately reflecting the composite nature of certain words, preserving the visible origins of their constituent parts. Furthermore, arguments were made for analogy, that if similar compounds were hyphenated, then a new or related compound should follow suit to maintain consistency. There was also the belief that hyphens preserved crucial distinctions, preventing the loss of nuance that might occur if words were prematurely merged into a solid form. For many, a well-placed hyphen was a mark of linguistic care and scholarly rigor. Conversely, those who argued against excessive hyphenation, advocating for the consolidation of words into solid forms, emphasized simplicity and economy. Fewer marks meant a less cluttered appearance on the page, potentially easier readability by reducing visual interruptions, and, significantly, simpler typesetting for printers. This approach also aligned with the observation of natural linguistic evolution. Words do naturally merge over time as they become more familiar and frequently used. This tendency towards consolidation was also often viewed as embodying Webster's original spirit of simplification and promoting a distinctly American approach to orthography, one that prioritized directness and efficiency. The types of compounds that frequently became subjects of this debate were varied and numerous. Noun plus noun compounds were a common battleground. Should it be steamboat or steamboat? Adjective plus noun constructions like high school versus high school also provoked discussion. Verb plus adverb formations, such as draw back or drawback, similarly posed challenges. Compounds involving prefixes, like re-enter versus re-enter, were intensely scrutinized, especially where the prefix's meaning needed to be distinct from a homographic solid word. Compounds formed with prepositions, such as man of war, presented their own specific problems of unity and meaning. Words beginning with self, e.g. self-control versus self-control, and those with common adjectival elements like well or ill, e.g. well-being versus well-being, also regularly found themselves at the heart of these orthographic disputes. Even compounds formed with participles, such as hard-working versus hard-working, were subjected to close examination and differing editorial judgments. Each category, each individual word, offered an opportunity for lexicographers to apply or debate their principles, contributing to the protracted and detailed nature of the hyphenation controversy. This protracted debate over the humble hyphen escalated far beyond mere academic quibbles, becoming heated due to a complex interplay of professional rivalry, significant commercial stakes, nationalistic fervor, and fundamental ideological differences. The individuals involved were not just obscure scholars. They were intellectual giants of their time, and their reputations were intrinsically linked to the perceived authority and correctness of their dictionaries. When a rival dictionary challenged the orthographic choices of another, especially on something as pervasive as hyphenation, it was seen as a direct assault on the lexicographer's expertise and judgment. Disagreements were not confined to private correspondence. They were aired publicly, dissected in meticulous detail within lengthy treatises, critical reviews, and academic papers, turning the linguistic arena into a kind of intellectual jousting ground. Beyond scholarly pride, there were immense commercial stakes involved. Dictionary sales in the mid-19th century represented big business. A dictionary that secured endorsement from state legislatures for use in public schools, or that became the preferred reference for influential educators and government printers, could command massive profits. Conversely, a dictionary perceived as inconsistent, outdated, or incorrect could face financial ruin. The minute differences in hyphenation, therefore, were not just about abstract linguistic principles. They were about market share, about securing lucrative contracts, and about establishing long-term dominance in a highly competitive publishing landscape. Publishers like the Merriam Brothers understood this implicitly, investing heavily in revisions and marketing campaigns that often subtly, or sometimes overtly, highlighted the perceived superiorities of their Webster editions over Worcester's. Adding another layer of intensity was the persistent undercurrent of national identity. The debate often touched upon a deeper, more fundamental question. Should American English forge its own distinct path, or should it continue to adhere closely to the traditions and conventions of British English? Webster's original project was profoundly nationalistic, seeking to define an independent American linguistic standard. His followers, including the Merriam camp, often framed orthographic reforms, including the simplification of hyphenation, as part of this broader nationalistic endeavor. Worcester, on the other hand, was sometimes characterized, perhaps unfairly, as being too deferential to British norms. Thus, a decision about a hyphen could be imbued with symbolic weight, representing either a step toward American linguistic independence or a concession to perceived foreign influence. This nationalistic fervor injected an emotional charge into what might otherwise have remained purely academic discourse. Furthermore, fundamental ideological differences underpinned many of the hyphenation disagreements. These often revolved around the concepts of prescriptivism versus descriptivism. Should dictionaries prescribe rigid rules for language users, dictating what is correct, or should they primarily describe current usage as observed in the language? Hyphenation often fell squarely into this philosophical battleground. Some scholars believed that strict logical rules, even if they occasionally deviated from inconsistent popular usage, were necessary for linguistic order. Others argued that the dictionary's role was simply to reflect how educated speakers and writers actually used the language, even if that usage was sometimes inconsistent. This tension between standardization and organic linguistic evolution was particularly evident in the choices made regarding compound words. Another ideological divide was between simplification and tradition. The desire to make language more straightforward and easier to learn often clashed with a reverence for established forms and historical precedents. The role of critics and periodicals cannot be overstated in amplifying the heated nature of these debates. Literary journals, academic reviews, and even popular newspapers of the era frequently published lengthy articles that dissected the hyphenation choices of the major dictionaries. These reviews were often far from neutral. They took sides, offering meticulous and sometimes scathing critiques of one dictionary's orthographic principles while lauding another's. The public nature of these critiques, read by thousands, further fueled the rivalry and forced lexicographers and publishers to publicly defend their choices, often in equally lengthy rebuttals. These exchanges, while conducted through formal prose, were nonetheless laden with intellectual passion and the desire to assert authority. Finally, the academic and educational influence of dictionaries meant that inconsistencies or perceived errors in hyphenation could undermine their authority among a crucial audience. Teachers, grammarians, and authors looked to dictionaries as the ultimate arbiters of correct English. If a dictionary's hyphenation policies were seen as arbitrary, inconsistent, or simply wrong, its credibility as a guide for instruction and writing would suffer. This broad reliance on dictionaries as authoritative guides meant that even seemingly minor orthographic decisions carried significant weight and could, therefore, provoke substantial contention among those responsible for upholding linguistic standards. The lexicographical process itself, particularly in the mid-19th century, added another layer of complexity to the hyphenation debate. It was an immense undertaking, a meticulous and often painstaking endeavor that required incredible dedication and precision. At its heart was the rigorous task of collecting usage. Lexicographers and their teams of readers and assistants would pore over vast amounts of written material: books, newspapers, magazines, official documents, and correspondence. Their goal was to observe how words were actually used in context, including how they were spelled and, crucially, how compound words were hyphenated or not. This empirical approach was fundamental, but it also presented a challenge. Common usage was rarely, if ever, perfectly consistent across all publications or all writers. Different authors, different publishing houses, and even different regional styles might adopt varying hyphenation practices for the same compound word. This inherent variability in collected usage immediately brought forth the monumental burden of consistency. For a dictionary containing hundreds of thousands of words, achieving absolute and unwavering consistency in hyphenation was an almost superhuman task, especially when the underlying principles for hyphenation were themselves evolving and contested. Each decision regarding a compound word, whether to hyphenate it, make it solid, or keep it as separate words, had to be weighed against an emerging, or sometimes absent, set of principles. A reviser encountering a word like lighthouse would not only look at current usage, but also consider its etymology, its clarity, its analogy to other compounds, and how its treatment might align with the dictionary's overall orthographic philosophy. Should it be lighthouse, lighthouse, or even lighthouse? Each choice carried implications for the dictionary's internal coherence. This intricate decision-making process, repeated tens of thousands of times, made perfect consistency an elusive, yet highly desired goal. The printer's perspective also played a vital, often overlooked role in these discussions. Typesetting in the 19th century was a laborious, manual process. Each letter, each punctuation mark, including every hyphen, was a physical piece of metal type that had to be individually set by hand. The more complex or inconsistent the hyphenation rules, the greater the potential for error, and the more time-consuming the typesetting process became. A clear, straightforward orthographic guide was not just an academic ideal, it was a practical necessity for efficient and accurate printing. Hyphens were not merely abstract symbols, they were physical entities that occupied space on the line. Furthermore, hyphens were critically important for line breaks. In order to achieve aesthetically pleasing and evenly justified text on a page, printers frequently had to break words at the end of a line. For compound words, the hyphens served as the natural point of division. Debates over whether a particular compound word could be broken, and if so, where, further complicated matters. For example, if steamboat was considered a solid word, how would it be broken at the end of a line? Would it be steamboat, which might imply a hyphenated form, or steamboat, which could be awkward? These practical considerations often created a dynamic tension between the lexicographer's linguistic ideals and the printer's operational realities. The relationship between the dictionary editors and the master printers was, therefore, a close and often negotiating one, with each side influencing the final orthographic presentation. The sheer physical challenges of producing massive dictionaries with complex hyphenation rules meant that practicality often tempered theoretical purity. As the mid-19th century progressed and the war of the dictionaries raged on, the Merriam-Webster camp, driven by both commercial ambition and a commitment to refining Noah Webster's legacy, continued to update and revise their dictionary. The most significant revision after Goodrich's 1847 edition was the publication of Webster's unabridged dictionary in 1864, often referred to as the Great Quarto. This monumental undertaking was led by Noah Porter, a distinguished scholar who later became president of Yale College. The 1864 edition represented a concerted effort to bring greater consistency and scholarly rigor to the entire work, and hyphenation was a significant focus of this revision. Porter and his team meticulously examined the orthographic principles, including those governing compound words. The preface to the 1864 edition often contained detailed notes on orthography, attempting to articulate more systematic rules for hyphenation than had been explicitly stated in earlier editions. While respecting Webster's original spirit, the revisers also sought to create a more logically coherent and consistently applied system. A discernible trend in this and subsequent Merriam-Webster editions was a continued, albeit cautious, movement towards consolidating familiar compound words into solid forms, especially for those that had gained widespread usage and whose individual components no longer required explicit separation for clarity. Words like steamboat, railroad, and newsboy, which might once have been hyphenated, were increasingly presented as solid compounds. However, this trend toward consolidation was not absolute. The revisers understood that certain categories of words still demanded hyphens for clarity, pronunciation, or to maintain a semantic distinction. For instance, compounds with prefixes, such as re-enter, to enter again, distinct from re-enter if that were to mean something else, though in this case, a solid form often emerged later for re-enter as well in specific contexts, or cooperate, often retained their hyphens to prevent mispronunciation or to emphasize the prefix's independent meaning. Adjectival compounds preceding a noun, like well-known in a well-known artist, were also generally retained as hyphenated forms to clarify their function as a single modifier. The process was one of nuanced decision-making, acknowledging the dynamic nature of language, while striving for an authoritative standard. The ongoing tension in these revisions highlighted a fundamental challenge in lexicography: the dictionary as a snapshot versus the dictionary as a guide for future usage. Was the dictionary merely to record existing linguistic habits, however inconsistent, or was it to provide a rationalized, reformed system that would guide writers and printers toward greater clarity and consistency? The hyphenation choices often reflected this inherent struggle. The revisers aimed to be descriptive of prevailing usage among educated writers, but also prescriptive where usage was ambiguous or where a clearer, more logical rule could be applied. The slow, incremental shift in usage, documented and often driven by these dictionary editions, continued throughout the late 19th century and into the 20th. Words like today, which had been hyphenated for centuries, gradually shed their hyphens to become today. Similarly, railroad transitioned to railroad. This evolution was not always linear or universally accepted at the moment of change, but over time, the consolidation tended to prevail for many common compounds. Other significant American dictionaries also emerged, offering alternative perspectives and contributing to the evolving understanding of hyphenation. The Century Dictionary, published in parts from 1889 to 1891, was another monumental achievement in American lexicography. While often considered more descriptive in its approach, it too had to grapple with the complexities of hyphenation, sometimes offering slightly different conventions than Merriam-Webster, reflecting different currents of thought in printing practices and scholarly opinion. Despite the best efforts of these lexicographers to establish definitive rules, the lingering challenges remained. New compounds were constantly being formed, particularly with the rapid technological and scientific advancements of the era. Specialized terminology often required its own specific hyphenation conventions. The incorporation of foreign loanwords also brought new hyphenation dilemmas. These ongoing challenges demonstrated that language, particularly its orthography, is a living, breathing entity, perpetually in motion, even after intense debates appear to have settled certain points. The work of codifying and standardizing would, in essence, never be truly finished. In conclusion, the protracted and surprisingly heated debate over the placement of hyphens in mid-19th century American dictionaries, though seemingly a minor linguistic detail, was in fact a microcosm of much larger intellectual, national, and commercial struggles. It underscored the profound importance placed on language in a young nation seeking to forge its own cultural identity, distinct from its European origins. The humble hyphen, that slender, often overlooked mark of punctuation, became a battleground where competing philosophies of language met head-on. This debate involved the titans of American lexicography, figures like Noah Webster and Joseph Emerson Worcester, whose intellectual legacies were built upon their attempts to define and standardize the English language for a burgeoning America. Their differing approaches to compound words, Webster's leaning towards consolidation and simplification, Worcester's inclination for more traditional, often hyphenated forms, reflected deeper ideological divides concerning prescriptivism versus descriptivism, and the pace at which American English should diverge from its British roots. These academic disagreements were amplified by the significant commercial stakes involved, as dictionary sales represented a lucrative market, and the perceived correctness of a dictionary directly influenced its adoption in schools and by the public. The impact of this fervent period of orthographic contention was far-reaching. It shaped not only the specific entries in American dictionaries, but also influenced broader printing practices, setting standards for publishers and typesetters across the country. It established a precedent for educational standards, guiding teachers and students on what constituted correct English usage. Moreover, it fundamentally molded the very perception of what an authoritative dictionary should be, solidifying its role as a guide and arbiter of linguistic norms. The intellectual energy expended on these seemingly minor orthographic decisions imbued American English with a unique character, defining its particular approaches to compound words that persist to this day. The legacy of these mid-19th century hyphenation battles is evident in the rules and conventions that govern American English hyphenation even now. While there is still complexity and occasional fluidity, many of the foundational principles and typical patterns for hyphenating compound words owe a debt to the exhaustive and often contested work of these pioneering lexicographers. Their meticulous debates, their struggles for consistency, and their efforts to balance tradition with innovation laid the groundwork for the hyphenation standards that quietly guide our written communication. The story of the hyphen, therefore, reminds us that even the smallest marks on a page can embody significant historical currents and intellectual fervor, continuing to influence our language long after the passionate arguments that brought them into being have subsided into the quietude of settled rules. The dynamic character of orthography persists, demonstrating that language, in all its minute details, remains a perpetually evolving testament to human communication and thought. Good night.